and welcome to another ISTAT Learning Lab. Today we're going to talk about the need to invest in sustainable aviation. And to do that, we have Niklas Lund in the studio in Stockholm. Niklas is the CEO of Rockton, and he has 35 years of experience in banking and investment banking, and most of all in aviation markets, both as principal and as an advisor, including 6 years with a publicly listed aircraft leasing company, initially as CFO and later as CEO. Since 2008, Niklas has acted as CEO of Rockton in Stockholm, which until recently was a conventional lessor primarily of regional aircraft. In the last 3 years, Rockton has pivoted towards the ascending sustainability sector in aviation. And as of now, the company is fully devoted to investments enabling the forthcoming transformation for the industry. Among other assignments, Niklas serves on the board of Airlink, the aviation NGO, where ISTAT is a big supporter, by the way. So during Niklas's presentation, you can ask questions or post comments by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write in those questions or comments. And to the extent we have time after Niklas's presentation, I'm going to go over those questions or comments with Niklas. And with that, I want to hand over to Niklas Lund.
Thank you, Nils, and thank you, ISTAT, for inviting me. Happy to do this presentation today, and I will start with trying to share the screen. So bear with me for... Okay, so today's subject is about investing in sustainable aviation. It's a pretty wide subject, so I can't go into all details in all aspects, but I'll try to cover as much as possible. So the agenda is that I'll do a short introduction of Rockton. I'll touch upon the aviation's part in the climate changing world, and then move over to what tools are available for sustainable aviation, or for that matter also will be available, and to the degree they are investable. And I'll finish up by applying that to what is needed to reach the net zero objective that the industry has taken on. And Nils has already given my background, so I'll jump over for that and go directly into Rockton. So Rockton was founded in 1998. We deemed ourselves to be a boutique lessor. We were primarily active in the regional sector, foremost with turboprops. It's been going quite well over these 25 years. We returned over 30% IRR to our investors. In 2017 and 18, we started to look at sustainability in aviation. And the reason we did that we got a bit inspired by some Swedish and Scandinavian corporates that were very early on the bandwagon on sustainability transformation, much earlier than what we see today. So we spent a lot of time looking into this. We have met a multitude of companies, probably close to 100 over this period, also engaged with science and academia to understand the forces behind this. And now we adhere to the notion that sustainability and growth and profitability in aviation will go hand in hand moving forward. So hence we are fully dedicated now to sustainable aviation. We sold off all our other assets. We will focus and invest in sustainable companies that are developing the sustainable technology and solutions, and also the hard assets that will come out of this. So that was the background on Rockton. So just shortly a little bit on aviation and the changing climate world. You probably know a lot about this, but I'll just run through it. So how big is aviation's impact on climate? Well, tailpipe emission is between 2 and 4%, depending who you listen to. Unfortunately, there are other effects that aviation have, and that's that we emit most of our emissions at high altitude. And there are two major effects there. There are also some minor, but the major effects are natrium oxide emissions that affect climate by on the ozone layer, on the ozone, and also methane. Actually prolongs the lifespan of methane. So, and the third one is, the third one actually is the formation of contrails that also occurred due to aviation at high altitude. If we recalculate those effects into CO2, so what's usually called carbon dioxide equivalents, you can add 2 to 4%, and another 2, or actually up to 2 times as much if you add it all up. And that's the total effect of aviation's climate effect. So we put it that aviation in context of other sectors, because we're not alone out there being an emitter. So we have iron and steel, which is big, about 7% of global carbon dioxide emissions. Cement, about the same, a little bit larger. And road transportation is at as high as 17%. And if we then add back the high altitude emissions, aviation is somewhere there, 8-9% or something like that. So we're a big emitter. And there are of course other sectors also, but I just took these as examples, and actually there's some relevance like come back to on iron, steel, and cement later on. And as you all know, the industry has taken on to reach net zero by 2050, both through IATA, but also on the governmental side on ICAO. Both have that goal, those goals now to reach net zero by 2050. So the question then comes up, of course, what tools will be available, and also a bit on, are they investable enough or not, sorry. So when I talk about sustainability here, I only will talk about the negative climate impact. There, of course, in the concept of sustainability, there are other things, but for this purpose today, we'll only deal with the negative climate impact. And the viewpoint here is from an independent investor's perspective. So the viewpoint is not from an airline or a lessor, but from an independent investor's perspective. Of course, that might not be the case for you, but that's where we start. And of course, you can adapt that to your own situation. Another thing to note is that I will not dive into the policy matters. It's quite important, but that's a separate subject that's going to take a long time to cover. So I'll touch up on policy, but basically I left that out to more looking at the commercial aspects. So start with just an overview of available tools. One is of course sustainable aviation fuel. That is a big part of the road to net zero. There are currently 9 approved technology and feedstock combinations to reach that, which you probably have heard about before. And they are anything from oilseed plants and algae, solid waste, agriculture and forestry residue, fats, oils and grease, and so on, and also ethanol, of course, for biomass. And importantly, also, I guess, just to touch upon that there's no silver bullet here. There's a combination of several different tools that has to be used. Otherwise, we'll not even get close to net zero. And they all have the pros and cons. There's no perfect solution. Another one is, of course, new propulsion technology, which is not based on fossil fuel. I'll go deeper into that later on. Another way of dealing with it is direct air carbon capture and storage. So that means basically sucking out carbon dioxide from the air, capture that, and then store it in mine shafts. It could be drilling holes for oil and others. And by doing that, you actually get a net negative in terms of carbon, because you actually remove carbon dioxide. Another way of using direct air carbon capture is to use it as feedstock for synthetic fuel, or what's usually named power to liquid fuel, and sustainable aviation fuel, where you combine green hydrogen and through a synthesis you actually insert carbon dioxide. Another part is also infrastructure. And infrastructure in this context, I guess, it's mainly two groups. One is the infrastructure needed to implement these new technologies. Could be, for example, electrical charging for electric or hybrid electric aircraft. Could be what you need to handle hydrogen. And the other part is not depending on that, but basically how to electrify, or for that matter, use hydrogen on existing infrastructure. For example, you could electrify ground equipment at airport, and perceivably also an airport who is dependent on electricity from a grid, which is to a large extent based on carbon energy. You could instead, build a solar panel park and power the whole airport in that matter. Then, of course, we also have the traditional improvements and tools that is ongoing and has been ongoing for many, many years in aviation. So that's incremental improvements of current technology, anything from aerodynamics and aerostructure, improvement of current propulsion technology. Importantly, this will not bring us to net zero, but it definitely can help, and it's part of the solution. And finally, we have navigation operational improvements. So that includes air traffic management, air traffic control, improvement of enabling airlines to fly straighter, less holding patterns, and so forth, to reduce fuel burn and thus emissions. That could also be operational improvements on airline bases. One example would be to use like one engine when you taxi and so forth, but also save weight in other ways, spending less time at the gate and so forth. Everything to reduce fuel burn and thus emissions. So, and now we'll go through a little bit on the pros and cons from our point of view on these different tools and technologies. So we'll start with SAF. It's available today, however, as you probably know, at a very minuscule level, but still available. Some of these pathways, there are different pathways for the different types of SAF, are commercially available and also are at the technical readiness level, which is, if you're accustomed to that, that's 9 when they have a commercial market and it's proven. Others are not. The majority is actually not developed fully, but are well under the way. The current demand for SAF is very strong. Airlines want SAF to a high degree, and so there's more demand than supply at the moment, and probably will be so for quite a long while. And if we, for example, use IATA's pathway to net zero, we will need to have 400 million tons available by 2050, which is a big quest. I'll touch upon that further down. So the downside to SAF is, of course, that it's expensive. If you take away financial support subsidies, it's about 2 or 3 times, up to 8 times as expensive as Jet A fuel. Policies concerning SAF is not completely set yet. It's need to harmonize. So whatever is deemed as SAF, and for example, in the US should be deemed as SAF in Europe and vice versa. That need to be worked out. There are some potential feedstock issues, not the least on biomass, for example, because if you expand or actually scale biomass, you will very easily get into competing with food, and that's not the idea. That will not be deemed sustainable. And there is also definitely improvement you can do on production cost, but it's going to be very hard to get close to Jet A fuel cost, or Jet A fuel price, basically. But it's definitely investable to invest in facilities and so forth going forward, but also if you can lay your hands on it, actually invest in the SAF itself. Then moving over to propulsion. So importantly in propulsion, all of these new technologies do have a fairly considerable certification challenge. The certification authorities, both in Europe and both the EASA and FAA, are on it, but it's a big quest for them to actually cover all this, because they're dealing with new properties here, that partially new properties at least. So we start with the full electric one, which is the energy source is batteries, and you have electric engines on the aircraft and or drones, or could be also an eVTOL. It is deemed sustainable. If you're full electric, it can be upgradable, the performance over time, as the energy density in batteries improve over time, which it has done so far, and there's every reason to that will continue and might even accelerate. So that's interesting, because a 5-year-old full electric aircraft, when you exchange the batteries, will have better performance than when it was new, which is sort of, you know, the reverse that we're used to before as asset owners. There are also retrofit possibilities to retrofit current aircraft with a full electric propulsion system. The major limitation on the full electric one is that it currently has range and payload limitations, due to that the energy density of those types of aircraft, of the batteries, don't allow it to fly very long, especially not the operational range, because if you have a conventional takeoff and landing aircraft, when you fly A to B, of course, you have to carry reserve to reroute to another airport, and that means that energy reserve might be even larger than what you need to fly from A to B. Your development of this type of aircraft is depending on the battery density development, but it's definitely investable. There are projects out there. There are certain that's come quite far in terms of certification. Others are more in the early days. You got the whole range there, basically. The other solution is the hybrid electric, where you still have batteries and electric motors, but you add another power source, which is usually a jet turbine engine. That gets an extended range and payload, so you can reach a larger universe, so to speak. You can reach the lower limits of regional aircraft. Same thing here. Performance is upgradable as new batteries will develop over time, so you will get better performance in the future on the same aircraft. Nevertheless, you still got range and payload limitations, initially at least, compared to the traditional propulsion aircraft of the same size. You will definitely not be able to fly as far as that, but it will improve over time. And of course, as you will use your jet turbine engine, it will be less sustainable than the full electric one, unless, of course, you use SAF as your power source to the jet turbine. And for both of these, actually, I guess for all of these, some of the applications might give you a sustainable impact, not in aviation, but because it will substitute road transport. So that could be, for example, on the eVTOL sector, you could substitute road transport. Cargo drones, for example, could also substitute road transport, but it still has a sustainable impact, even if it's not exactly within the traditional aviation spectrum. Then we have the hydrogen electric solution, where you have the energy source is hydrogen, and then you have a fuel cell converting the hydrogen to electricity, and that powers electric motors. At least what's presented today, you'll have about the same range and payload capabilities as the hybrid electric one around there. We'll see when all of these are up and flying for real, so to speak. Same thing here, you got retrofit possibilities, and you've probably seen that for both Universal Hydrogen and ZeroAvia are working on retrofits of existing traditional aircraft types. Hydrogen is challenging in many ways. It has great energy density to weight, 3 times better than Jet A fuel. However, its volumetric density is about 25% of Jet A fuel. So one good, one bad. You need to procure green hydrogen, which is hydrogen that is produced by renewable energy. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't make sense out of a sustainability perspective. That's very minuscule at the moment. It is definitely something that's growing, but it might not be that easy to get hold of it. But for smaller quantities, it shouldn't be major issue. But once you scale, it could be an issue. What's definitely an issue is the hydrogen infrastructure challenge. Hydrogen is our smallest molecule we have. It's quite volatile. So you can't use the existing infrastructure at airports to harvest this. You have to use new infrastructure. And of course, companies like Universal Hydrogen is working on that, but it would be fair to say that it is a challenge to reach something that is certifiable and safety and commercially viable there. But it's definitely investable. The last solution is hydrogen combustion, which is theoretically viable for larger aircraft. There you use hydrogen as the fuel and you use a combustion engine instead. That is in terms of time. We're talking about the mid 2030s. Possibly might very well be later. So obviously there's a big challenge of actually building an aircraft like that, but it's probably a bigger challenge actually to get the infrastructure in place, because you don't do a clean sheet design aircraft and new technology that's going to be way up in the double-digit billions of dollars unless you got quite a lot of airports to fly to. Doesn't make sense. So to make this come true, the whole ecosystem of aviation has to agree that hydrogen is the solution, and importantly, invest heavily. We're talking about trillions of dollars to make this come true in that case. So continuing with the tools, touch upon direct air carbon capture. The benefit there is actually a net negative. So you remove carbon unless you use it for power to liquid production. It's quite expensive today. It's the current very few facilities that are there. About the cost to remove 1 ton of carbon dioxide runs in the $500 to $600 per ton. If you compare that to the market price of carbon under the European trading system, which is the carbon credit system in Europe, which puts a price on daily or on carbon, that is currently at 85 euros per ton, which is probably equivalent to about $90 per ton. That's the whole idea, is that actually that's going to be more expensive over time. So to make it compatible, direct air carbon capture needs to be more efficient, which is every reason it's going to believe. And it's something we'll probably see in the future to make that gap close much better. So it's still pretty early stage. It's expensive, as I just said. And of course, this is not specific for aviation, but it's for every industries. But if we look, for example, at IATA's roadmap, I think that they see about 19% of the road to net zero for aviation is actually carbon capture. Then infrastructure, we talked about just slightly that, either new tech solutions infrastructure or to the current infrastructure to electrify it, for example. That's possible. It is a pretty diversified supply landscape, and the new tech segment, it is not surprisingly pretty immature, but it's definitely investable as such. And incremental improvements of current technology have a track record. We're doing that. The industry is doing that for decades. In terms of investability, not so much, because most of it, not exclusively, but most of it's done in-house by the OEMs and the large supply network. So it's pretty hard, with a few exceptions, to invest in that part. And then we got air traffic management and navigation, big potential. We have in the US, we have the Next Gen project, and in Europe, we have the Single European Sky, going on for a very long time, but hopefully it will get into place in not too distant future, and that actually probably will be able to reduce the effect then in Europe and US for those flights, but 10 to 20% fuel reduction over time, because we enable us to fly straighter, less holding patterns and so forth. That part is very hard to invest in because that's big legacy systems that's built up by FAA and Eurocontrol and EASA. But there are some other solutions like contrail detection and avoidance that doesn't need to be in the ATC, but can actually rest on the airline side. So that's navigation software that could be available for there. And of course, there are implementation issues and regulatory approvals. So it's just investable to a smaller degree. Operational improvements, those are ongoing by the airlines all the time to basically enable the airline to fly with less fuel burn and thus less emissions. There are some software solutions that can support the airlines doing this, both in flying, but also, for example, enable us to handle the time at the gates more reliable and actually get aircraft out of the gates and thereby saving fuel. And so you don't have aircraft sitting on the tarmac waiting to get into the gates and burn fuel in the meantime. But there's a limited amount of opportunities because most is done in-house by the airlines. So that was a little bit about the tools. And now, what is needed to reach net zero? So our view is as follows, that to reach net zero, we need and should develop more transformative technologies. So you can ask yourself, what is a transformative technology? In our view, it is technologies that increase efficiency and lower cost exponentially over time as they are developed. And I'll give you a few examples. So first, this is the price for solar and onshore wind farms to generate 1 megawatt hour of energy. So between 2009 and 2019, the price of electricity for solar declined by 89%. And in the same 10-year period, the price for onshore wind farms declined by 70%. So that you could compare with aviation's sort of rule of thumb efficiency improvement of 1% per annum, which unfortunately we can't say is a transformative development. It's still very, still good, but it's not transformative. But of course, when you lower the price for the output here this much, things happen. And now solar is, for example, the cheapest way to generate energy. And if you probably asked people in the oil and fossil industry back in 2009 if that was a good idea, I'm not sure they're going to say that it would be. Now it's different, of course. This is another example. This is the development of lithium-ion batteries. Since it's another timeline here. It's from 1992 to 2016, but just want to make the point. To store 1 kilowatt hour in a battery. That cost you above $6,000 back in 92. That price is now down to, in 2016, is down to $244 per kilowatt hour. So 96% drop. That's also an impressive number. And importantly, which I think can be partially applied also to aviation, is that there's a tendency to underestimate the power of transformative technologies. So this is a bit complicated graph, but bear with me and I'll explain. So the red line here, on the x-axis you got years, right? On the y-axis you got the annual installment of new solar power. And that's net, actually, including retirements. So this is what they install each and every year. So back in 2001, it wasn't very much, but it accelerated from basically close to nothing up to 150 gigawatts of new installed solar power. And the horizontal lines is what the International Energy Agency, which by definition should know a lot about energy, That's what they projected, forecasted in each and every year. So the line furthest down is the 2009 line, and then moving up. So that's their forecast for each and every year, what they thought or projected that the installed base would increase with every year. So it's a pretty consistent underestimation of the global solar capacity growth. And this just shows that point here is that it's easy to underestimate the power of transformative technologies. So applying that then to aviation, where could we find this in aviation? Possibly. I'm not saying it will happen, but no, where are the best prerequisites? It's definitely the continued development of batteries. So batteries today have an energy density. If you take the latest generation Tesla, I think it's between 270 to 290 watt-hours per kilo. The world largest, by far largest, manufacturer of batteries to the EV market, CATL in China, announced this spring that they're gonna produce a large production of new batteries that have an energy density of 500 watt-hours per kilo. So that's a big leap. And they say that's going to happen in this year, 2023. So that's a big leap. And there is reason to believe, because there's many different types of battery development going on, lithium iron solid state, and lithium sulfur, and a lot of others. So there's a lot of investment in R&D going into batteries, not primarily for aviation's purpose, but for electrical vehicles and grid storage. And some of those will be applicable for aviation. So there's no reason to believe that the improvement of energy density batteries will not continue. And it could actually be, some of these new electrochemistries might actually offer a big leap. Fuel cells, which then are used on some types of new technology aircraft. It's a question of how do you increase the energy efficiency, taking the energy in hydrogen, converting it into electricity. Currently, it's around 40 up to maybe 60% efficiency. That can likely be improved. There's a lot of things going on there. Avia working with their partners on it. So we think that it could be something that's definitely worthwhile watching and see the consequences of that. Talked about direct air carbon capture, room for improvement there, also getting closer to the $100 price tag per ton. Then it's a quite viable way of actually reducing your carbon footprint. Green hydrogen production is very important for aviation. It's definitely important for sustainable aviation fuel if you go the route of synthetic fuel, the power to liquid fuel, because the big feedstock there is green hydrogen. And two ways improving that, or probably many ways, but the two major ones is the efficiency of the electrolysis, which is improving. So every reason to believe that's going to continue. And maybe more importantly, the price of renewable energy, because it's extremely renewable energy. Takes a lot of energy to actually split up the water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. And everything points in the direction as renewable energy will be cheaper and cheaper, and that will lower the cost of green hydrogen. Question is then, when we come to sustainable aviation fuel, including power to liquid, will that also be going through a path of a transformation like the others? Power to liquid can sort of piggyback on the development of green hydrogen. Others have maybe not as easy. There are different projections out there. One quite serious prediction is that by 2050, where we'll have a mix of different stuff, in terms of where the feedstock and technology is, but the primary one will actually be power to liquid. If we look at, for example, the ISTAT's roadmap, that the price long term will come down to about 2 times jet A fuel. And that, of course, is better than today, but it's not a transformative price, right? because we do want to go through a transformation and at the same time lower cost. So I'll give you some numbers here. So it's some numbers of magnitude, I would say. So again, looking at the ISTAT roadmap, they say 65% coming from reduction of on the road to net zero, reduction of emissions from SAF. And that actually implies that you need to build about 5,000 to 7,000 biorefineries only dedicated to SAF production. And that means that you have to do that, you need to increase land usage to between 12 million hectares up to 20 million hectares. There are other calculations that show more like 60 million hectares, but just to give you an idea what 12 million hectares is, that's the equivalent of actually the whole landmass of Greece. So if you basically made all of Greece as an agricultural land, grew crops there, everything was used for SAF production, you would make it. But that's going to be hard. And so that's a big quest, of course. And if we look at then the electricity needed for power to liquid and or hydrogen, the ISTAT roadmap implies that you need about 10,000 terawatt hours. That would be about 20% of global future electricity production in 2050, which is, of course, a big number. Other numbers of magnitude here is that ICCT see that the renewable electricity demand in 2050 is the equivalent of all global renewable power generation in 2019, which includes hydro and everything else, which is a big number again. And McKinsey, just for another point of reference, see that in 2050, 30% of all global expected green hydrogen demand and thus production needs to come from aviation. If we then go back to the slide when I show the emissions from aviation and iron and steel and cement, you have to ask yourself, is it possible that aviation, which is about a fourth, a fifth of, if we just take cement and steel, there are other sectors also, will be able to put their hands on 30% of all green hydrogen? That's not, it's not given, let's say that. And again, just to give you a sense of scale here. So one scientist run out the numbers for what happens if all flights out of Charles de Gaulle, actually based on current levels of flights, out of Charles de Gaulle would be hydrogen powered. Well, to support that with hydrogen fuel, you need to, if you use wind farms, you need 5,000 square kilometers of wind turbine farms. That's twice the size of Luxembourg. If you go the solar way, you would need 1,000 square kilometers, or alternative, 16 normal-sized nuclear reactors. So my point is here, we're talking about very big numbers. Might be achievable in a way, but can it be achievable because everybody else are looking for green hydrogen, for example, especially cement, steel, because that's their roadmap to sustainability. So it's not going to be easy for aviation to take such a big share of it. So our conclusion is that there's a potential for a tech-driven growth initially in the regional and sub-regional aircraft markets that can then later on in the 2030s grow up to, let's call it smaller narrow bodies or large regional jets. We might even, we usually think about how aviation assets and airlines are working today. So, but it might look different in the future. I'm not saying it will be, but it might look different, that instead of flying a 180-seater, conventional narrow body, for example, within Europe, we might fly 2 single-pilot 90-seaters that are powered by the new technology to drive down to actually be sustainable. So it's not given that our patterns today will be just copied into the new world on a sustainable way. So, and importantly, new propulsion technologies will deliver lower operating costs when they're developed somewhat, and a significant sustainable impact. SAF will give you higher alternative cost than Jet A, but of course it will give you sustainability. It is uncertain if SAF really can scale to net zero by 2050, which I showed before. And our conclusion is that all these pathways, all these tools we talked about are needed, but I think we need to increase the resources to more resources to the transformative technologies, because that's really a solution we want. We want a solution that drives down the cost, but gives us sustainability. That's the best of all worlds. And we should be aspirational. But what also is needed is, of course, a vast amount of capital. So McKinsey has looked at this, and they come up with a number between now and 2050 of $5 trillion, or 175 per year. Another number there is Lecht, another consulting company, come up with 3.5 to 5 trillion only for SAF. So we're talking mid single-digit numbers that's needed, in addition to our otherwise normal investments in aviation. And if we compare that to, there's been projections of what the aviation industry as whole, the whole aviation sector, that the profit between now and 2050 comes out at between 5 and 6 trillion, of which airline side is about half. So that means if aviation is supposed to cover this by its own, it's about 80–90% of all profits. And that can't be done, because then you get no return to investors, and nobody will, nobody will actually give you money, basically, or capital. So to finance a pathway to net zero, capital is definitely needed from outside the aviation sector. So where will this capital come from? Well, initially, the aviation sector has to put up investment themselves. Otherwise, why would other participants in this join this market if not the sector itself believes in it, right? So that is airlines, and we have airlines that are investing real money, not only doing policy statement, but actually investing. Same things with lessors. Lessors are, to some degree, I think, the best suited in many aspects to actually invest specifically in SAF and maybe carbon capture, not because they're perfect suited, but they are a financial actor in the ecosystem of aviation. And if you do it the right way, it probably will give you quite competitive advantage, but I'm well aware of it. It's pretty difficult to include that in your current business model. And of course, OEMs also need to do it, and they are doing it on the SAF side, but all this will need to be scaled up. A, to actually provide the money, to give a proof to other parties that aviation believes in this, not only resting on others. So, of course, public capital is needed, and there are available under the Inflation Reduction Act, as you probably know. There are subsidies, financial support available for SAF development, for technology development. The EU is working on its basically the response to the ERA Act, the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which is now going through the decision process in the EU. Because EU usually gives you more sticks than carrots, but the Green Deal Industrial Plan is supposed to be more of carrots. And then, of course, various individual countries have their own initiatives. But importantly, the idea of public capital in these kind of development is not to be there perpetually. It's there to actually help the technology to develop, to mature, so it can be financed on normal commercial terms. That has been done before, for example, in the solar panel market. Some countries gave very heavy subsidies, and that turned out to be a great thing, because now we got a very efficient solar generation energy. And then, of course, we need to have the private capital coming into the market. And that is private equity capital and venture capital. the state of the market is today, or the maturity of the market today is probably, or in most cases, a bit immature for private equity. Private equity wants more mature markets and proof of both technology and market. Venture capital is investing, but not heavily. And there's several reasons for that. One is that from a venture capital perspective, investing in SAP for an OEM developer, they're developing new technology aircraft. It's very capital intensive, and it takes quite a long time before you actually reach your goal of actually having aircraft certified and commercially accepted, compared to what they are used to. But they are there, but again, we need more maturity to lure in more capital from them. The aviation lenders have to also step up to the plate. Infrastructure capital also need to come in, but again, they need a more mature industry to a lot of extent. The whole idea with infrastructure capital is that, you know, the risk is low on all aspects, feedstock, technology, and offsets. And I don't think we're really there yet in many aspects. But once it's proven, we will see more infrastructure capital coming. But no, there are lenders there and equity providers, but at a smaller scale currently. One big pocket of capital is, of course, the fossil industry. They have enormous resources, and they are engaging in SAF development, as you know, and that's probably, they're probably more inclined to maybe move in a bit earlier than what you would see from infrastructure capital and private equity. And it's interesting to see how that develops, how much they actually will allocate to the capital needed, especially on SAF and carbon capture. So finally, just a few words of, if you would invest in this sector, how do you navigate, and what do you need to think about? Well, our view is definitely you need to apply a diversified investment strategy. As you've seen, there are a lot of different tools, there are a lot of different roads to this. It's not totally given which of these will be successful. You know, they might all be successful in their own way and so forth. So you need to spread your bets, to have a portfolio. Then you can, you know, tweak that to some degree, depending on if you're an airline or if you're a lessor to whatever business model you're protecting. But in our view is that you definitely need to diversify. You need to leverage expertise and network. I mean, this is new for most. You need to get into the networks that are dealing with this to understand who are the experts and leverage them. It's not usually your existing network. So that takes time, that takes resources. And you also have to have devoted focus, devoted resources to this. This is nothing you can do sort of as a side job. You need to have resources available to spend time on this, understand it, engage in it, because due to the basically immaturity of the market, a lot of things are happening all the time. And you have to make your own opinion to how you think it will develop, what are the best technologies and the roads and the teams that are developing and so forth. And you also need to understand the regulatory and policy landscape, because you don't want to invest in technology that is about to be deemed not applicable. So that's an ongoing work that's been done on, you know, governmental and other bodies, organizations. You need to follow that so you navigate the right way and don't take the wrong bet from a regulatory perspective, for example. And finally, if you don't start off as a independent investor, but you know, you start off as airline, OEM, lessor, you need to figure out how a strategy like this, how that could be aligned with your business model. Do you need to tweak your business model and so forth? But that's obviously up to each and everybody to come up with their own solution to that. So with that, the presentation is over and it's over to Q&A.
Thank you, Niklas. Very interesting. We have a few questions. Alessandro Vasquez is asking if you could share the biography of the sources of this CO2 emissions that you mentioned in the very early slides?
Sure, I don't have it, I haven't memorized them, but they are from, some of the sources can be out. I mean, there are a couple of different ones. I can share them after, but I don't have them available right now. But there are a couple of different sources.
But I mean, it's an interesting question because, I mean, is there an established science and how you measure the CO2 emissions and especially the CO2 equivalents?
Yes and no. I mean, the tailpipe emissions is basically each and every engine manufacturer knows how much CO2 are emitted on the engines. That's there's probably on granular level it might be debate about it, but otherwise it's pretty precise. On the equivalent, you're right, they're not totally agreed, but I'm pretty sure they will be agreed, and the magnitude is so large, so it doesn't really matter if let's say contrails. There's a debate there between 0.5 of all equivalent of 0.5 of all CO2 emissions up to 2 times CO2 emissions. So in our view, at least, doesn't really matter if it's 0.5 or 2 for actually investing in it, because if you can actually reduce that dramatically, you still make a huge benefit out of it. But yeah, you're right, there's still debate about that, but we don't really have the time to haggle over exact to the last decimal how it should be. But we know that there are effects, and if the effects are big enough, there is a call for action.
Yeah, but I guess there's a whole cottage industry of companies that would help various players measure and estimate the emissions, and depending on the utilization of aircraft, et cetera,
yeah,
because we have to monitor these metrics to see what kind of progress we are making, right?
Yeah, and that's a big thing. I mean, which is not very encouraging. I mean, we're in 2023, and the industry hasn't agreed on what metric we should use for improvements, right? We're still debating that, but we all know it needed. It's just a question how is it RPK, CO2 per RPK improvements, and so forth. That doesn't mean. I mean, for us at least, it doesn't mean that you wait until somebody comes up to that, because if you know that there's an impact, you do it, you invest in it, and then you figure out that later. I understand that the airlines that's going to report and everything else needs to have it, but one can't, well, at least in our view, we can't take the attitude of, no, we don't know the metrics, therefore we abstain from trying to do something about it.
Yeah. Niklas, Professor Raghavan at Embry-Riddle in Florida, he's a very faithful listener to the ISTAT Learning Labs. He's asking how you have perceived the investor attitude towards investing in this space.
Yeah, I mean, aviation is, of course, very important for us, right? Not necessarily for everybody else. I mean, let's say that you're an investor who's dedicated to invest in the sustainable transformation, and you can, for example, invest in a solar panel park, right? So proven technology, very good track record on keeping cost budgets and so forth. And the offtake is usually with 1 or 2 major utilities for long periods. So pretty low risk, right? If you compare that, for example, to invest in somebody who has a SAF project, which the technology is maybe tested in a test lab level, but not fully commercial. Can you be sure that the feedstock that's needed is going to be there for 20 years? Do you have offtake agreements with good credits for 10, 20 years? Not that easy. So it's more of a comparison to other investment alternatives. But there are definitely those that are doing it. But I think we need, so it's not that nobody's interested. People are interested. But the more we can mature these technologies, the more interest and more capital we'll get there. And that's where we need both public capital, but we also need capital from the aviation sector itself. Otherwise, we don't believe it. We need to show that we believe in it.
Yeah. We have one question here. What made you want to change your focus from being a boutique lessor to tackling the sustainability sector of the aviation industry? What are the most profitable aspects of your business now?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a different business, but our conclusion was that, and that's well known, it's not going to be easy for aviation to transform, but we came to the conclusion that there's plenty of opportunities there. There's definitely risk, but if you spend enough time and resources, you can't eliminate the risk, but at least you can maybe lower it and mitigate it. And if you succeed, you will be plentifully rewarded. So we see a lot of good rewards there because the demand for these solutions will only increase. So it's a question of no risk reward, and we see that the reward will come, and you know the payback will come. But of course, you have to have a different mindset than your traditional lessor, which is completely different.
Yeah. Joshua Catcher has a relatively long question. I'm going to read this now because I won't be able to memorize it. To theoretically open up huge swaths of land to use for SAF capacity, it could be strategic to note that a shift away from farmed animal products could free up the 3/4 of global arable land that is used for farmed animal production and growing feed for farm animals. Some reports show SAF using farmed pig feedstocks, fat. Does this really make sense to source SAF from inputs of farmed animal feedstock like pigs, when climate impact data shows farmed animal industries are as big, if not bigger than the impact of the transportation sector, especially when we have options like algae, etc. Should airlines and airports emphasize plant-based foods and taper off the use of leather in airplanes and opt for better plastic-free bio-based alternatives? There you go. And I want to throw in another aspect of this question. Why do you want to produce the SAF at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris by putting all the windmills in Luxembourg? I live there.
No, that was just the size of it. So in terms of land capacity, I mean, that is an issue. And if we look at how, for example, under the CORSIA model, you do factor in land usage, and you're not sort of allowed to take farmable land that's used for food, basically, and use that to instead produce biomass for SAF, because then you will, your net contribution will be very low. So you're supposed to use new land that's not used today. That's of course a big challenge, especially in like Europe and US. I mean, in the US, 40% of all corn grown in the US goes to biofuel. I mean, not all to aviation, but a lot. So yes, it's very hard to see unless you go to Africa or maybe something like there, and if you can make that happen, how you would actually increase the land usage to meet this requirement. I mean, to some degree, definitely, but if we look at the 2050 numbers, that's going to be really hard. And on the using feedstock from animals, again, that will be calculated in the equation. So probably will not make sense if you have a emitting animals. That's probably not. But if that's a restitute and then you're going to have the animals anyway, it might work. But then again, it's obviously very hard. How do you actually? Because you need a lot of feedstock, right? And of course, SAF facilities have to a certain degree, size matters to get cost down. And if you need, how do you actually get hold of enough from animals and pigs and all that? That's going to be very hard, So that's a feedstock issue also. But
Then Guillermo Brito is asking, this is an interesting question about batteries. What are you going to do with the batteries? I mean, is there like a second-hand market for batteries that have been exhausted their capacity to be recharged? And how do you kind of recycle batteries?
Yeah, so that's something that's on the agenda for not only aviation but also from the vehicle industry. So that's part of at least the programs we're looking at. Part of that is the second life of batteries, and that's also, I would say, a requirement from the airlines that are about to take on these aircraft. So you can either do two things. You can dismantle them, which actually you get quite a good price for today. That might not stay forever, but that's one. Or you repurpose them, for example, because the thing is that on aircraft you need a lot of energy. So once you're below or close to 80% of capacity, it doesn't really work for an aircraft because you need that 100% or close to. So then you can repurpose them, for example, for grid storage. So grid storage is obviously less sensitive to volume and weight. So if you put them in a shed, a big number of batteries, and they work perfectly fine, even if they're down to 80% of capacity. So it's definitely something which the industry is working on. It's not something that has been forgotten, and it's part of the offering that will come. And the airlines on it also. So they want to be comfortable that the second life is taken care of.
Yeah. Niklas, on the topic of SAF, I mean, it sounds like SAF is kind of relatively tangible, and also the good thing with SAF is that you can use more or less the same engines and aircraft that you have today, right? But isn't the CO2 emission effect different depending on how that SAF is produced?
Right. Yeah, it is. So you will. There's a equation which is pretty complicated, right? So depending on the feedstock, depending where that feedstock comes from, depending on transportation, depending on the technology you're using to process that, you will get a different percentage number of net zero. So nobody will be actually 100% net zero. Even power to liquid will have, when you actually build a power to liquid plant, you emit and so forth. So there is a fairly complicated equation that gives you that. So some will contribute more, some a little bit less.
Yeah. Okay. Then another question. I remember our compatriot Greta Thunberg. She went to a climate conference in New York, and I think she went there on a sailboat.
Right.
So obviously you could reach net zero easily by just not flying. One thing there is that jet A fuel, as far as I know, is not taxed.
Right.
But if I drive my car here in Luxembourg, I pay about 30% of the price I pay at the pump as excise taxes, and then another 70% is VAT. Yep. So it's like it's apple to oranges when it comes to how the environmental impact is punished by the taxation.
Right.
No, I mean change.
Possibly. I mean, there's. I guess the tradition was, or the reason was that after the war, everybody wants aviation to grow. Binding communities and countries together. So there was no tax, and that stayed that way. But now in the EU, there is definitely more and more people talking about that it will be taxed, and very hard to say will that happen or not, but it's definitely not unlikely. And you can also see, for example, if let's say you're a trucking company, right? So you move around cargo in Europe, and you have to pay tax. But if you put it on an aircraft, there's no tax. EU, for example, is supposed to be equalize competition. And that way it doesn't equalize, right? Because so the guy who runs that trucking company say, hey, why should I pay tax when the airlines, when they take cargo, don't pay tax? So of course, it's depending on how many burdens, for example, EU will put on aviation, but we shouldn't say that there is no risk. There's definitely risk, but of course, it's politics. It's very hard to have an assumption on it. But I wouldn't be totally surprised if there's some sort of tax coming out.
Yeah. Okay. Because you mentioned that maybe as much as the tailpipe emissions contributes to global warming, there could be an effect from, for example, contrails.
Yeah.
When you went over the tools to reach net zero, what are the tools that could address the issue of contrails?
So contrails there's two things. You have to detect the contrails where so contrails basically form when there is simplistically unusually cold and unusually humid, so that they don't form everywhere. And the areas where they form are like a Chicago pan pizza, pretty wide, a bit thick, but not too thick. So the way you avoid them is to usually fly above or below, so you reroute. But you have to detect them, and there are basically two ways of doing it. Either you model it, you see where there's high probability where they will form, and you do it that way, or you visually identify them through real-time satellite image. And the latter one is the best one because you get more reliability. You get also verification that you used it. And then you can see, how much contrails did we actually avoid? So that's the way of doing it. But that the airlines can handle themselves, because you don't have to descend very much, a couple of thousand feet, 1 or 2 maybe, and then you avoid it. So it's sort of a low-hanging fruit compared to a lot of other challenges. If you believe in what we believe in, having looked at all the science on it, that the magnitude of the effect, which is basically that the extra clouds that they turn into lock in heat, which are not in the weather system, then you get a great benefit if you can reduce that by 70-80%. It's the best net effect you can get from anything, basically.
Yeah. I also understand that the air traffic control system is such that airplanes typically fly about 20% further than they would need to do if they flew a straight line between origination and destination.
Yeah.
That sounds like low-hanging fruit as well. Absolutely.
No, that's what I talked about, the next gen in the US and the Sky Europe, whatever it's called again. Yes, and I think they've been working on that, but it seems to be really hard to implement it. But I think that European one has been promised to come out in a year or 2. But it's somebody need to kick somebody in the butt to make that happen, because it's very low-hanging fruit. But of course, it's easy to say, but of course, it's all about safety, right? Can we make this in a way that's applicable in safety? But it should definitely be, if money what's needed, EU should throw money at it and, make it happen, because if we're serious about this, we should definitely, start with the low-hanging fruit, especially, return on investment is going to be wonderful for society.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Niklas, I think that's the extent of the questions. If you could just come back on that biography of
sources for CO2.
I would contact ISTAT, and we can see if we can post it somehow on the website. And then I just want to so thank you very much, Niklas. Very interesting.
My pleasure.
I want to remind everybody that on October 24th, we have another learning lab with a presentation from Jet Zero. That's a company that is developing a very efficient bladed wing aircraft. And then later on in December 5th, we have another fight between Jerry Butler and Jeff Thornton about the state of the market. There may be other learning labs coming up in between, so check istat.org for more updates on future learning labs. And thank you so much for listening and calling in, and have a nice rest of the day or evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.